Well, hello there everybody, welcome back to the channel. Dodgy Gamer here with something a bit different for you today. We're focusing on some major news from the world of Football Manager. And no, before you get too excited, it's not the FM22 announcement. It is instead something people have been mentioning, asking about and asking for a very long time. It's the addition of women's football. That's right, it's finally official. And we've got the lowdown on the details of today's announcement, what we've learned from it, and a quick look at the reaction so far. So first of all, something to make clear, this is not the first feature announcement for FM22, something Miles Jacobson has already emphasised on Twitter. It is instead something in the works as a long-term project with no fixed deadline or even approximate timeline, and we'll get onto why a little bit later. Now, until today, the Football Manager team at SI, not that they make any other games that I'm aware of, have always been a bit vague about the possibility of women's football in the game. Comments and replies, responses to questions from the public would generally be along the lines of it's something on our radar, but never implied that it was something on their to-do list. Now, that all changed this evening when Radio 5 Live shared a clip on Twitter from an interview with Emma Hayes where she was talking about Football Manager having a women's game like it was very much a real thing.
You know, Fran Kirby becoming, an extremely popular player on Football Manager because, of the qualities they may or may not have seen of her on television. I think it will drive people to our game. I think it will drive a Football Manager audience to our game.
Miles Jacobson quickly piped him with a tweet suggesting that perhaps somebody had jumped the gun. But never mind tomorrow. Twitter was soon awash with discussion about the possibilities, what could be coming our way, and very soon we had an official blog from Miles at SI. So let's take a look. So here is the official announcement from the official Football Manager site. So the link for this is down in the description if you haven't checked it out already and you want to have a look for yourself. So this basically just outlines how the game is going to be expanded to include women's football. Now, we all know SI go into a lot of details. Elsewhere, there's been a lot of other media discussion about this, and they've mentioned things like, Football Manager is never finished. We're constantly developing it, extending it, added new features. So in a way, they're approaching the women's game with that kind of idea. And that's perhaps the first point to bring up, that they say that they have no interest whatsoever in a standalone women's football version of FM. So we're off to a great start. That's, I believe, the right way to approach it. So I love the phrasing they've used here, one sport, one game. They are going to include women's football in there with the game we already play. So this first part is interesting to see the kind of philosophy behind it. They talk about the fact that cost has previously been a barrier. I know Miles has mentioned this on Twitter before, but they've kind of made a decision at this point that, the cost shouldn't dictate this. This should be something they need to do, they have to do to promote the women's game. So that's exactly what they've decided to do, and all credit to them for it. Elsewhere, Miles and Emma Hayes, they've been out doing media interviews all day, it would seem. It seems like lots of media outlets, newspapers, sports websites and so on are going to be running features on this over the coming days. But there in the Telegraph, Miles Jacobson did comment there about there's no point sitting around waiting for the right time financially to come along. They should just get out there and do it. Interestingly, I did have an idea for a video sketched out in the initial planning stages. I was going to kind of speculate on why the women's game hadn't been introduced to Football Manager yet, and why it wouldn't just be a simple matter of adding in some new leagues, some new teams, and some new players. And it's interesting to see that I was right with a few of my ideas. They are mentioned here. So the obvious one I first thought of was the match engine, that it would require potentially a different match engine. It is mentioned here about the animations. We can see here they've been doing some motion capture for women's football already. Now, I was thinking very much from an animation point of view, again, perhaps making that classic mistake that we often do of confusing the 3D match animations with the match engine. The match engine obviously looks at the whole game, not just the highlights that we see. And they mention here also the attributes, the fact that female players will have different attributes compared to men. So this then affects the match engine, so that needs to be worked on slightly separately. One other thought I'd had was on the subject of injuries and how perhaps female athletes, female footballers might get slightly different injuries, or certainly with different severity and different frequency to their male counterparts. And that is something they discuss here, although it's more in relation to things such as the menstrual cycle and pregnancy. So they've kind of gone into a slightly different angle. Now, one thing I also had in my notes was the financial aspects of thinking about TV deals, wage structures. You've perhaps got different revenue streams for women's clubs as well. You've got that kind of balance to strike between how do you model having a club which is affiliated to or a part of a wider football unit, such as the Manchester City and Chelsea women's teams, and then at the same time you've got standalone women's teams, and how do you model both of those. But they do go into a few more details here, a few things that I hadn't thought of or didn't know about. The fact that the transfer system, the contract system, is quite different in the women's games, and there will be unique rules that apply in many women's leagues around the world. And then there's also this section here on in-game text and translation. So they're talking about all those news items, all those reports and updates, scouting reports, coach reports, all those various bits of information about players that they would have to be reworked, rewritten to include female pronouns and so on. And then, of course, translated into many different languages. And it's interesting here that Miles does mention that that is going to take up most of the time, as well as the bulk of the cost, which he's talking about being millions to implement this. So interesting that it's not the motion capture, it's not the graphics, it's not the licensing, it's this kind of seemingly banal aspect of generating and translating text strings that's going to take up the bulk of the budget. So to quickly summarize what we've learned from this announcement, first of all is the fact that they've been laying the groundwork for this for some time. So obviously it's something that takes a lot of research. They don't just want to throw it out there as some kind of tack-on part of the game. So already a lot of time and effort has been put into it. A lot more time and effort is going to go into it. We also get details on how the motion capture process with Rosie and Molly Cometa has begun, and also research with a person specifically appointed, Tina Keach, to head up research and development for the women's database. And that's another thing to mention, I suppose, the database. We take the database in Football Manager for granted, perhaps, but it's something that's been built up over decades, really, to get to that level of detailed information. So then to obviously build something like that pretty much from scratch for female players is obviously not something that can be done in a couple of months. And there's also been talk of initially 10 to 15 league competitions being added from different countries around the world. Which ones specifically, we don't know, but as there are probably around 20 professional women's leagues around the world, it shouldn't be too difficult to guess. Now, there was no specific mention of it, but I would expect international football to feature quite prominently in a women's addition to the database. After all, interest in those women's international tournaments predates the growing interest in women's club football, so come on, Football Manager, make sure it's in there. And of course, the other thing we don't yet know is the timescale, the release date, but from the sounds of things, Sports Interactive themselves aren't 100% committed to anything along those lines just yet. So on to the reactions to this announcement, and they have been incredibly positive in the Football Manager community, particularly on Twitter. Just scrolling through my timeline, seeing lots of comments praising it. In the Discord groups that I'm a member of, it's been the similar thing. Lots of all caps letters, exclamations of yes, or statements like finally appearing everywhere. Now, this will obviously be a boon for content creators, with several already announcing their intentions to do videos, to run series, to do Let's Plays with this when it's available, when the project's been realised. Although these are general intentions so far, nobody's announced a save or come up with a thumbnail yet. Now, there will be inevitably, and sadly already have been, comments along the lines of, "Oh, never play FM again," or "Why don't you do this or that instead?" But Miles addressed that quite eloquently in his interview with The Telegraph, telling those kind of people to do one, and I'll join in with that sentiment. Now, I personally am looking forward to the possibilities this will open up for those journey manager style of careers. Maybe you start out as a small non-league club and you move over to the women's game to build up your reputation before going for your dream job, or maybe you start out your career at a women's team and see where it takes you. Maybe you'll move in and out of the two sides of the game, or maybe you'll just stay in the women's game or something like that. It just depends how it develops. It's always great to have further options in Football Manager to add to the depth and realism, and that's what I think this is going to bring. So there we have it, a summary of today's major news that will define and shape the long-term future of our favourite game, Football Manager. So please do share your thoughts and reactions down below in the comments section. But for now, thank you very much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you like this video, you get the bell on for notifications. I'm Dodgy Gamer, and I'll see you again soon.